89 AD Arena of Capua. A gladiator, fresh from battling 3 opponents, stands victorious as the crowd erupts into cheers. The emperor claps in approval, but the spoils of war are not what you might expect. Instead of gold or freedom, the reward is a woman, a captured Dacian, terrified and chain-dragged to the underground chambers of the amphitheater. This wasn't a crime. It was a rite, a tradition, a documented reward bestowed upon Rome's champions. Welcome to the carnal victory system of the Roman Empire. This isn't fiction, it's well-documented history. The poet Juvenal spoke of it in his satire Vi, while the historian Suetonius chronicled it in his Lives of the 12 Caesars. Martial wrote about it candidly in his epigrams. Rome gave us laws, aqueducts, and philosophy, yet it also turned women into human trophies for bloodied warriors. Today, we will unearth what Roman historians wrote about the grim reality of gladiators and female prisoners, practices that Hollywood conveniently overlooks and your teachers never mentioned, but that Rome meticulously documented. This narrative does not highlight honor or epic battles, but rather the terrifying underground chambers beneath the Colosseum, where prisoners were treated like trophies, all in the name of justice. Why is it that everyone knows Maximus Decimus Meridius, but few are aware of what transpired after the applause faded? Because history often favors myth over horror. Each week, we expose what has been concealed. If you seek unfiltered history, subscribe, because what follows will fundamentally alter your perception of the Colosseum. Imagine being reduced to another person's possession. You are locked in barracks known as ludi, trained to kill. If you endure long enough to evoke a crowd of 50,000, you are awarded a prize. In 1st to 3rd century AD Rome, over 250 arenas operated simultaneously across the empire. Gladiators were not romantic figures. They were slaves, criminals, prisoners of war, and legally treated as incomplete persons. Upon victory, the editor of the game's organizer presented the gladiator with options: money, wine, a clean bed for one night, or Victoria Carnalis. Suetonius documents this in detail. Tacitus mentions it in his Annals, and Cassius Dio records it without censorship. Victoria Carnalis granted gladiators access to female prisoners of war Dacian, Gallic, Briton, German women captured during military conquests. They had no rights, no legal protections, and no ability to refuse. These women were not prostitutes. They were human spoils, property of the Roman state, and handing them out as prizes cost the imperial treasury nothing. This was not merely casual depravity. It was social engineering. Gladiators risked their lives to entertain the empire, and rewarding them without spending gold was economically savvy. Moreover, publicly humiliating women from conquered territories sent a clear message: look what Rome can do. Even your women are not safe. The philosopher Seneca, present at these spectacles, chillingly wrote, "I come home more greedy, more cruel, more inhuman because I have been among humans." Rome had transformed brutality into routine, horror into bureaucracy, and suffering into entertainment, an ethos meticulously documented and archived. Now that you understand the system, let's delve deeper into what Juvenal and Martial described concerning these underground chambers, witnessing the horrific reality without censorship. Here's what the poets observed. After a victorious combat, the master of games descended into the hypogeum, the underground labyrinth beneath the arena. According to Suetonius, the gladiator was presented with a bronze tablet listing available rewards. If he chose Victoria Carnalis, he was allowed first pick of the captives. Martial vividly recounts victorious fighters being led through cells where female prisoners waited. Some still wore torn clothing from their captures, while others had been prepared by attendants, washed, hair untangled, made presentable. The gladiator would make his selection, and guards would unlock the chains, bringing the chosen woman to what Roman administrative records chillingly labeled reward chambers. These were not makeshift spaces. Archaeological evidence from various Roman amphitheaters reveals small rooms with stone benches, Io rings anchored in the walls, and doors that locked from the outside. They were meticulously designed, as integral to the architecture of the arena as the tunnels used for lions or elevators for gladiators. Juvenal sarcastically critiques these practices in Satire V, confirming their existence while mocking their normalization. He depicts women allocated as prizes to blood-soaked champions, describing the act as routine, just like distributing money or wine. The selection process was bureaucratic and systematic. A clerk would record each transaction in official ledgers. One Dacian female, approximately 20 years, transferred to Gladiator for Victoria Carnali's reward. The ultimate degradation, human beings reduced to inventory items. However, this system served a purpose beyond merely rewarding fighters. It was a form of psychological warfare. Tacitus in his Annals outlines Rome's strategy with conquered peoples, not only military defeat, but the complete obliteration of their spirit. How do you destroy a people's will to resist? By taking their daughters, wives, and priestesses, the women they fought to protect, and handing them over to slaves as entertainment. Cassius Dio records that after Trajan's conquest of Dacia in 106 AD, thousands of Dacian prisoners were brought to Rome, including women from the tribal aristocracy, daughters of chieftains, and wives of warriors, individuals protected by their societal status. During Trajan's grand celebration featuring 123 days of games, the message to every conquered nation was clear. This is what happens when you resist Rome. Your men perish in our arenas. Your women become our property. Resistance is far worse than surrender. Suetonius highlights this practice during numerous imperial celebrations. The influx of female captives created a surplus exploited by arena managers as cost-free rewards. This strategy was calculated, systematic, and entirely legal under Roman law. The poet Martial witnessed such distributions firsthand, remarking, "The victor takes his prize as Rome takes its tributes by right of conquest, without mercy, without shame." He didn't condemn the practice. He merely stated the facts because, in the Roman mindset, this was justice. The conquered existed solely for the pleasure of the conqueror, a natural order honed through centuries. What is most chilling is the organization behind it. This was not chaos, it was administration. Roman records indicate that arena managers meticulously cataloged captives available for rewards, noting their age, origin, and physical condition. Suetonius describes the role of the procurator luterum, the game's administrator who oversaw everything from lion procurement to prisoner allocation. These officials collaborated with military commanders who provided captured women from conquest zones. Gaul, Germania, Britannia, Dacia. Each military campaign further fed the arena's insatiable desires. Women captured on battlefields in present-day Romania or Germany would be transported across the empire, filtered through military camps, catalogued, and ultimately delivered to arena-holding facilities. Cassius Dio notes that supply shortages arose in years void of significant military campaigns, forcing arena managers to resort to more traditional rewards, like money. Consider the implications. An empire built an entertainment system that depended on a constant supply of conquered women. Juvenal sarcastically remarks in Satire VA that some gladiators preferred Victoria Carnali's to cash payments because, unlike gold, Rome's enemies were infinite. The chambers where this occurred were maintained by arena staff. Tacitus mentions attendants responsible for cleaning, lighting torches, and ensuring privacy, not for the women's dignity, but to uphold the charade that this was separate from the public spectacle above. Guards were stationed outside not to protect the women, they had no rights, but to prevent unauthorized access. The reward was exclusive to the designated gladiator. Administrative tablets from Pompeii and other sites reveal standardized forms for these transactions. One partially preserved document reads, "Hereby granted to gladiator, name, for meritorious victory, choice of captives, origin, duration not to exceed 1 night, to be returned to holding by dawn." Human suffering was processed with the efficiency of a grain shipment. Pause for a moment and reflect on this. We have just outlined how Rome transformed sexual violence into awards, humiliation into practice, and suffering into bureaucracy. If you think that was the darkest aspect of this narrative, you are mistaken. What follows reveals how Rome made its own citizens complicit, how silence became a means of survival, and how an entire empire convinced itself this was the norm. The system needed more than just gladiators and prisoners. It required everyone else to look away. Seneca, who admitted that attending the games made him more cruel, also observed in his letters to Lucilius that he sat among Roman citizens' fathers with their sons, Mothers with their daughters watching these spectacles unfold. Nobody objected. Nobody protested. Why? Because Roman society had normalized this through the concept of dignitas or social honor. To publicly object to imperial practices was to question Rome's right to rule. Such questioning meant risking your own dignitas, leading to social death. Thus, thousands of spectators turned a blind eye as conquered women were dragged beneath the sands. Tacitus recounts an incident during Emperor Tiberius' reign when Senator Marcus Valerius publicly questioned whether certain arena practices aligned with Roman virtues. Within a month, he was accused of treason, stripped of his family's property, and ultimately died in exile. The message was unmistakable: watch, cheer, or at the very least remain silent. Juvenal encapsulates this perfectly, illustrating senators bringing their families to the games, including young daughters, exposing them to these horrors from a tender age. It was socialization through spectacle teaching the next generation that this was normal, acceptable, and the price of empire. Suetonius notes that Emperor Claudius executed 3 citizens who left the arena during executions not for protesting, but because their departure implied disapproval. Staying meant complicity, leaving meant rebellion. The system ensnared everyone. Gladiators were slaves with no choice. The prisoners were property with no rights, and citizens became complicit witnesses bound by fear of objection. Martial describes this paradox in his poetry, portraying a father explaining to his son why a captured Dacian woman was being taken. She came from a people who resisted Rome. This is what happens to Rome's enemies. The cycle of indoctrination continued. Yet history records moments when the facade faltered, when even Rome's brutality became too egregious for its citizens to bear. Cassius Dio documents an incident during Emperor Commodus's reign, circa 192 AD. Commodus, obsessed with gladiatorial combat, began personally selecting captives as rewards, expanding the practice beyond prisoners of war to include the daughters of political enemies, Roman citizens treated like conquered foreign women. One victim was the daughter of a senator named Quintus Pompeius. She was a Roman citizen protected by law until Commodus decided otherwise. According to Dio, when the guards came to take her, her father stood in the doorway, only to be killed on the spot. She was dragged away nonetheless. That night, Rome's elite began plotting Commodus's assassination, not due to his tyranny in general, which they had tolerated for years, but because he had crossed an unspoken boundary between conquered foreigners and themselves. It wasn't motivated by morality. It was a matter of self-preservation. The assassination of Commodus was successful on December 31st, 192 AD. He was strangled in his bath. Yet the system continued. Tacitus recounts another moment during Emperor Nero's reign. After the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, when Nero scapegoated Christians and ordered mass executions in the arena. Among them were Christian women subjected to public violations before their executions. The poet Martial was a witness and described these horrific incidents in vivid detail in his epigrams. Unexpectedly, parts of the audience began to leave not in protest, as that was far too perilous, but quietly exiting. Nero's guards blocked the exits and leaving became forbidden. Still, Tacitus noted that even among those who hated Christians, the spectacle produced disgust. For a fleeting moment, even Rome's own citizens questioned whether they had gone too far. The uncomfortable truth, of course, was yes. Yet the spectacles persisted for another 200 years. Take a moment to consider everything we've explored. The system, the practices, the bureaucracy, and the pervasive silence. Which aspect do you believe was the most disturbing? The ritual of selection, the chilling efficiency of bureaucracy, the forced complicity of citizens, or the fact that this continued unchecked for centuries? I'd love to hear your thoughts. At what point does a society become irredeemable? Now, what did Roman historians themselves conclude about all of this? Interestingly, they documented it all. Their tone, however, reveals a darker truth. Suetonius reported these practices as matters of fact, no moral judgments. This is how things were done, he indicated, describing Victoria Carnalis as he would grain distributions. Martial's tone was different, satirical, and mocking. He wrote epigrams highlighting the hypocrisy of Romans who pretended to be civilized while engaged in such barbarism. In epigram X, he noted, Rome claims to bring civilization to barbarians, but what civilization teaches men to celebrate suffering? He was not demanding change. Rather, he was exposing contradictions. Tacitus came closest to actual condemnation, lamenting, "Even for enemies of the state, the punishment exceeded justice." That phrase, "exceeded justice," was as close as a Roman historian could venture to critique the system without risking accusations of treason. Juvenal weaponized satire in Satire V, using it as a brutal indictment of Roman society's treatment of women. He carefully contextualizes the arena's practices not as isolated horrors, but as tangible manifestations of Rome's moral decay.